Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles.
So we're reading now the second statement regarding the transmission of Jewish guilt for the death of Jesus. Right? Last week we did origin, and I suggested that that's around 200 CE, 200, 225, 250 CE, as one of the earliest people who developed that point, interpreting the line, his blood be on us and on our children, as meaning in perpetuity. And now again, we're going to read something from John Chrysostom, the bishop at Antioch. And I mentioned to you that he was a very unusual sort of guy. The point I'm going to make is, again, I don't know if it was clear, these 8 homilies against the Jews that he preached in 388, the basic point was to prevent Christians from going into synagogues and become enamored in any way with things Jewish. Not that he was necessarily afraid that they would abandon Christianity, but they would find meaning, spiritual meaning and spiritual truth in things Jewish. Okay? That was his purpose. In a sense, it's in the tradition of Deuteronomy, right? Anything that smacks of paganism is a no-no, okay? And I mean, literally. And so syncretism is against his philosophy. And, I understand that. I think, today a Jew would prefer, a rabbi, that Jews do not incorporate elements of other religious faiths into Judaism, as a Christian or a Muslim today would say the same thing. Okay, but the point here is, though, the difference is, in order to make the point, he has to say things very negative, that are very negative regarding the Jew, in order to scare these people out of the synagogue and away from these horrible people. And so he plays up, so this is from his 6th homily. This is not his first. We will read something else from his first homily in a moment. But this is his 6th homily, where he specifically focuses on this notion of the guilt that has been transmitted from the time of the crucifixion down to his own day. And I remind you, if you look at your texts, you will see all the word, every U, Y-O-U, is in bold. And the first one refers you to there's an asterisk, which refers you to the bottom line, which tells you that the U here means the Jews of that time. Okay? And even though they're not necessarily there, he's giving this in a church, not in a synagogue. But he's referring to to the Jews, as if they were there. And in a sense, feeding the people listening with a script that they should have in their mind should they happen to go into a synagogue. You, meaning the Jews, in Antioch 388. All right? All right, so now this is what he has written. All right, somebody please read to me from John Chrysostom, Homilies Against the Jews, number 6. Okay, Bert.
If he turns away from you now because of your sins, he should have done so all the more in those days.
All right, if he, meaning God, turns away from you, in other words, abandons you, okay, and leaves you to the whims of enemies.
Why isn't the he out of curiosity capitalized?
I don't know. That's the way it's printed.
Okay.
All right. So if he turns away from you now because of your sins, he should have done all the more so back then, when you really did some seemingly horrible things. In other words, in biblical times. Think of the prophets of biblical times, right? Think of God's disappointment with the people after the Exodus and the golden calf. All right, all that negativity. That was, you'd say, that's real heavy-duty stuff. Okay, so if he turned away from you now because of his sins, he should have done more so in those days, because you really did some bad stuff. Basically, his question is, so why has he turned away from you now? That's the question that this is pointing to. Why has God turned away from you? Why are you in such, you, Jew, Mr. Jew, why are you in such a subservient, weak, low-level position as the Jews? Remember, this is 388. The zeal of the Christianization of the Roman Empire is hot. Okay, by 388, that process is well established in the sense of the policies that are emerging from the Christian Roman Empire, the Christian Roman emperors. You see the beginning right in this period of time of restrictive legislation in codes, in Roman codes, Roman law, with a Christian slant to them, that are starting to implement certain steps which reduce the status of the Jew. Okay? Remember, prior to Constantine's acceptance of Christianity, decades before this, and then the formal establishment of Christianity as the state religion of the Roman Empire, which again is a few decades before this. Prior to that, the Jews actually stood in a higher position, a higher status in the Roman Empire than did the Christians. I mean, you understand that. The Christians were being killed, not all the time, but depending upon their pagan zeal and the extremes of their nationalism, Christians were being killed because they were out trying to convert Roman citizens, which was a no-no. All right? That all flips once the empire becomes Christian. That all flips. And so the Jews are now in a reduced position. And it's beginning to take effect in terms of policies of the empire. And of course, the churches in different places are empowered to become much more virulent in their preaching on this. And so Chrysostom is part of that process. All right? Now, just one final point of introduction and a reminder. Chrysostom's impact was strong at this point. It faded over time as other elements of thought and outlook emerged both in the Eastern and the Western churches. But in Europe, in the Western Church, in the Catholic Church, as opposed to the Byzantine Church, in the Catholic Church in the High Middle Ages, Chrysostom became a subject of study once again. So his writings in all different kinds of ways were being read and studied. And so one has to suggest that this notion, again, he will be one of the voices that is talking about this notion of the that passage in Matthew refers to the eternal damnation of the Jew because of having killed the Messiah. Okay, Bernie.
Rabbi Rembaum, Saint Helena that set up these pilgrimage sites.
Yes.
Was the daughter. So this was before this, slightly before this. I just looked it up.
Yes.
But he didn't really officially make Christianity the religion of the empire until after there'd been quite a bit of Christianity talked about and disseminated.
There's a difference in when he declared it legitimate. It wasn't until a number of decades later that it became, but it's before. By the time this is written, the that step was taken before Chrysostom gave these sermons. It was already in place. And as I'm mentioning, these rules began to change right around this time. The policies, the legal policies of the empire began to change. Okay, yes. All right. Okay.
So am I correct that what he's doing here is trying to make a logical argument leading up to the reason the Jews are in trouble is not because of all this other stuff, but because they killed Jesus?
That's one.
Is that what he's doing?
That's where he's going to go.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. But that's one element to be
Right.
sure. And wait till when you see the next statement, which is from his first homily, where he doesn't refer to that much, only a little bit at the end. But he's talking about all kinds of other things that you'll see. So that from the second reading is a much broader reading of a putting down of the Jew. All right, you'll see. We'll do this now. All right, so again, if he turns away from you now because of your sins, if you are now in a reduced status because of your sins now, he should have done all the more in those days, in Bible times, when you did all kinds of horrendous things. Bert, continue, please.
Okay. If he put up with you when you were living lives of ungodliness, he ought to put up with you all the more now that you venture no such enormities.
Right.
Why then has he not put up with you? Even if you were too ashamed to give the reason, I will state it clearly. Rather, I will not state it, but the truth of the facts will do so. Now, this is in bold, so should I read it louder?
I bolded it.
Oh, okay. You did slay Christ. You did lift violent hands against the Master. You did spill his precious blood.
Period.
And
who is the you?
Jews.
Which Jews?
Oh, the Jews of Antioch.
In 388.
388, right.
That's the point. This is not a specific, he's talking about these real people alive at that time. And that, of course, is, you can generalize the Jewish people, yes. But the you here is his focus, is on the community that is attracting these Christians into the synagogues, not necessarily actively. It's simply by their presence that the Christians are, interested in what's going on there. They believe they have these scrolls with the sacred original words of God. They love the Torah and all the pomp and circumstance that existed then when the Torah was read. That was big time for them. Okay? And they felt they were coming close to the same God. They were not denying Jesus. But Chrysostom was afraid that this would lead to a re-Judaizing of Christianity. That was his concern. But so here he says it, right? This is why things are bad for them now. This has totally, as he will say, outweighs anything as horrible as they may have done when they were following pagan practices that we all read about in the Bible. Okay? All right. Wait, Jackie.
This is kind of maybe a fine point, but as you know, it's become a big point. Was he actually, in his mind, in your opinion, blaming the Jews for the physical act of doing it, or for what they felt was collaborating, like the Romans really did it? That's what I'm confused about. Why did they not really come more on the Romans?
The point is very clear. The Jews said in Matthew 25, verse 23, his blood be upon, no, it's not Matthew. No, whatever. Okay. I forgot the exact verse number. But they said, his blood be upon us and on our children.
But did they make the distinction that the Jews then did not physically do it and that the Romans did? Why did they put more on the Jews versus
the point
the Romans?
Is the Jews said that.
The Jews were just Matthew and them, though, not all the Jews. I mean, it was some Jews.
But they didn't care about. That's the whole point.
Okay.
It was as if an Origen already, 200 years later, was saying that resulted in the eternal guilt. So, in other words, the notion that the Father can transmit the sin, right? They didn't ask the question that today's Christian scholars mention. Okay, if you are a Christian and you are a professor of theology and you're reading the Gospels, okay, you're going to say these people were talking about themselves and their families. They had nothing to say about the history, the ongoing guilt. Okay, that's how it's interpreted now. I mean, there are fundamentalists who believe the old way that we are guilty. But the point is, these people who are preaching this message believe that physically and spiritually, both, the Jews are guilty for his death.
And the Romans, what about them?
The Romans were just carrying out the will of the Jews.
Oh, I get it.
Remember, before this, Pilate washes his hands, symbolically saying, I am free from guilt. I wash myself of this man's fate.
Mm-hmm.
So then who is responsible? The Jew. That's what it says. It doesn't say for eternity, right? That's the Chiddush. That's the new interpretation that these church fathers.
And the Jews didn't push back? The actual Jews then?
Do
you think they tried to?
But by the time, it was irrelevant. The Christians in where the Jews lived, remember, the Jewish Christians by the 3rd century are non-existent. I mean, they may be floating around in small numbers, but in terms of a factor in the history of the church, by then they're gone, by the 3rd century. Okay, and in the process here, now I looked, for example, I reread Justin the Martyr, and he's engaged, it presumably really happened, with a dialogue with a Jew named Tarfon. Some think maybe it was Rabbi Tarfon. It was too late for the Rabbi Tarfon that's mentioned in the Talmud and in the Mishnah. Great scholar. Okay, but it's a name. It's a Greek name, Tarfon, right? Anyway, they get into a discussion. As far as I could read, and I reread a lot of it, that doesn't come up in 150 in the course of a disputation with a Jew. It's not mentioned. So it seems the impression one gets is at that point in time, this notion was not yet fully articulated. So it appears, I haven't done the research on anybody else who was talking, at that time. But it appears that the transition is taking into this notion happens at certain points late 2nd, early 3rd century CE. And that's why Origen, who is doing his work in the first half of the 3rd century, this is Matthew 27:25. That was the passage. All right. So Origen already is clearly articulating this. And then, over 100 years later now, Chrysostom is repeating the same concept. So we can say, at some point here, it became dogma. And that continued to be transmitted down through the centuries into the modern period, into the 21st century. There are Christians in the world today, I'm sure, who still believe we're responsible for the death of Jesus.
My last point, I'm just surprised that the Jews of those days, all the way through, were not responding.
They did not have the capacity to do it. Number one, the threat was not so great.
Right.
During the 1st century or so. Who cared?
Right.
Right? They were the power of Christianity. As I said, the Jews had the upper hand. They were not being fed to the lions, right? They were not being killed by Roman soldiers because they are defying Caesar. That wasn't happening to them. So forget it. The Romans will take care of it. Who knew?
But Rabbi Rembaum, from in these first few centuries, by then already the Jews were a minority. Is that true?
Well, let's put it this way. Yes. In Eretz Yisrael, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, a huge percentage of the Jews were no longer there. Nobody knows the exact numbers. There are those historians who say like 2/3 of them were either killed or left. It was bloody. Okay? But you now have the rise of the community in Babylonia, right? The Bavel and Bavel. That number was definitely growing, and that became the center. There were small communities of Jews in Europe at this time, but during those first centuries, again, Christianity in Europe was just percolating. And there were places in Europe where the Romans were killing Christians. So, I mean, the threat wasn't there, right?
I mean,
So the Jews, yes. So in Eretz Yisrael, it is very likely that non-Jews dominated the population. Where were the Jews in 200 CE? In Eretz Yisrael, there was a thriving Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael in the year 200. Where were they geographically?
Were they in Jerusalem or no?
They were in Galilee. That's it.
Oh, really? Okay.
They couldn't go in Jerusalem as against Roman law.
Wow.
But going forward, Rabbi, we always say, what I say is the reason there's billions of Christians and millions of Jews is the afterlife. And, but then that's not really true. There's a lot of Middle age things about Jewish afterlife. But I mean, there's no doubt there has to be a reason, why we started out as a visible, if not majority, at least.
Oh,
visible.
Yes, of course. Yeah, of course. I mean, the point is, you cannot, the playing around with numbers in antiquity is a very difficult thing to do. There are solid historians who were writing 60, 70 years ago who made the point that it's very likely that by the time these communities began to spread in the Roman Empire, 10% of the Roman Empire was Jewish. But at what moment? You can't pinpoint that. And in point of fact, if you listen to the numbers that are quoted by ancient sources, they're out of whack completely. I mean, Josephus will tell us that there were 600,000 Jews in Jerusalem at Passover time, and that got stuck inside by the Roman siege. It is impossible for there to have been 600,000 people in Jerusalem at that time. Physically, impossible. The most they could say, maybe the city itself had like 40 to 50,000 residents, and who knows how many other thousands came in. Yes, crowded it was, but 600,000? All right, so you project that kind of exaggeration or inaccuracy. Who knew? They didn't keep. I mean, even today there are arguments over demographic numbers that are much more carefully collected. But back then, so nobody knows for sure what the numbers were. But most scholars today say there's no way that the Jews could ever have been 10% of the Roman Empire. Those numbers are just bloated. So it's difficult to be very precise. All right, AJ.
Rabbi, am I correct in inferring that you don't buy the initial premise, the idea that there was this trial with a guy named Barabbas and the crowd around was saying, we take it upon ourselves, that was later propaganda, which then now you are trying to limit that dogma to a particular set of generation in order to get around it? Or do you accept that as factual?
I believe, not an article of faith, but as a historian, it makes perfectly good sense that the priesthood that was politicized, that was corrupted, as Josephus himself, by the way, tells us, that they were pushing the guilt of this man who was running around preaching, okay, because whether he was saying it or not, people were associating him as being a Messiah figure.
Wouldn't they have done the same thing to any messianic figure? Which there were a lot of them running around at that time?
Yeah, that's right. But this is apparently one that was that attracted some crowds. It attracted some interest. All right. Again, I'm assuming that the numbers that are cited in the Christian Bible, 5,000 people were fed, with fish, et cetera, right? No. I mean, the truth is, even if you read the Gospels, how many people really put their lives on the line for him, so to speak? The disciples, 12, and one of them turned on him, right? So, I mean, his intense following was tiny. But the point is, he happened to be a person who must have had some kind of charisma, and so it was known. And the priesthood, the leadership, was getting very nervous by his running around and either saying or allowing people to say that he was the king of the Jews, because that is a capital crime. And if the Jews were not seen as rejecting him, then, they could be in trouble. So they wanted to get him out of the way. Okay? And so here was a guy, he was in Jerusalem, right? He was in the temple yelling and screaming, not really understanding fully what was going on there. I mean, when he condemns the money lenders in the temple, that was basic policy. So the money lenders could go and buy sheep for sacrifices. That's what that was all about. It was a practical necessity.
Actually, I think you mean money changers, the exchangers.
Anyway, the point...
They had to change into shekels. That's not a lending, that's an
exchange. Right. So the point is that they wanted this guy out of the way, so they turned him over, Yeah, it's very possible. But there's so many inaccuracies in the stories of the Gospels. I mean, when they say the Sanhedrin met on Christmas Eve, on Pesach, the night of the Seder.
They didn't meet at night. They were prohibited from meeting at night.
It was not. If there was a meeting, it wasn't the Sanhedrin, because they did not meet on a holiday. If the priest gathered around them a few people, cronies, to get rid of this guy, okay, that's the point. It's very possible that happened, and they brought him to Pilate. Now, what appears to be a later reconstruction of it would have been Pilate's washing his hands of their guilt, because it appears that a later generation of writers, or the people who redacted these stories, wanted to soften the reaction of Pilate, to sort of whitewash him, so he did not come off as the guilty party. Because now the Christians want to make themselves look good in the eyes of the Romans for self-defense. So he is whitewashed, and so therefore upon whom is the guilt shifted? To the Jew. And so the point is, do I believe, is it possible that the priests could have brought him forward as a criminal, defying the rule of Rome? Yes. I wouldn't argue that point, okay? I mean, this is the only proof that we have of it. But I wouldn't argue it. It's possible. It's definitely plausible. But that's the end of it.
Do you see this character as at any point a threat to Rome itself, a threat to Roman order?
Yes. I mean, that's the whole point. Whether it really was, we don't know for sure. The priests were sensitive to this. They may have blown it out of proportion for all we know. It's possible.
So you think the priests wanted to get along with the Roman overlords?
Yes, they did. Because
so this was one, you think this character was one example of a of Jewish movements that were trying to revolt against Rome.
No, this was not a revolt against Rome. There were some modern scholars who said that. No.
I'm not talking about military revolt here, but I'm talking about overthrowing the resentment of the.
No. I'm saying the priests were worried about that, and they could have overblown the threat. That was their judgment.
But you don't see this character as being against Rome.
No, he was a Jewish preacher. That's all. His crime was so minimal. That's why I'm saying the priests overblown. They were overly sensitive. And we don't know whom else they turned over to the Romans. It's possible there were other people, but nobody recorded it. We can't answer that point. All right? But we know that the priests wanted to make nice to the Roman overlords. Okay.
And what role did the rabbis play?
Pilate in particular was a guy who really neglected enforcement of laws that showed respect to Judaism. Okay? And so these priests said, we'll do what we have to do to get this guy off our back. And so they did this. All right? That's the end of what I can say because we have no other information.
What role did the rabbis play in that?
Nothing.
That interaction?
Nothing. There were no rabbis then. They were Pharisees. Okay? And the only...
I'm sorry, but yeah, there were rabbis then. This would have been the era of the Tanaim.
No.
No, the end of the the Zuko. This is around 30 CE is when Shammai died.
No, it doesn't matter, but Shammai and Hillel were not rabbis.
Okay.
Title rabbi.
I retract that. What role?
Let me finish. Let me finish, please.
Okay, sorry.
So there is no evidence. The Pharisees argued with him, right? That's what the stories in the Gospels tell us, because they were also a preaching order. The priests were not always happy with the Pharisees. In fact, the Pharisees and Sadducees at certain times really did not like each other. And there was clearly, if you read later on, Yochanan ben Zakkai doesn't like the priests because they were corrupt in his eyes. Okay, so the point is, no, there is absolutely no rabbinic information whatsoever about Jesus that emerges until the 3rd century CE. And those are stories, okay? They're stories that Jesus went to Egypt, okay, and learned magic there and came back and did magic, all right? And that's part of their stories, all right? And that when they tried to crucify him, they couldn't because they wouldn't accept him. So they hung him up on a gourd. I mean, all kinds of crazy things about this man that developed over the centuries. But it doesn't reflect anything about what religious authorities. In fact, we know from Paul that Gamliel, this would be Gamliel the first, in the Sanhedrin, Gamliel defended Paul, and Gamliel said, "Don't worry about these Christians. They're a small group. They're going to go away." Okay, and that's in the Christian Bible itself. Read the book of Acts. All right, so that's the closest you have. Okay, and Gamliel was one of the leaders of the Pharisees. That's how he's noted, and that's a correct statement. So that's about it. So we're guessing here, but I don't think. All my point is, it is not unreasonable to assume that these overly sensitive, politically oriented priests wanted to get this guy out of the way. And ultimately, the truth probably is that the Roman governor said, okay, let's do it. No problem. If he can quiet things down, we'll take it. And it was the later writers of the Gospels who whitewashed Pilate And now I'm not the only one. I studied this, and that's what people suggest. So it's not just me. All right, moving on. I hope you don't. These are important things. I mean, thank you, AJ, for pushing us on this, because we've got to know a little bit. It's important we understand what scholarship is telling us about what went on then. And you have to realize that there is not a lot of concrete information that we would call serious historical documentation that can clarify any of this. We do know at this time, yes, there were rebellious movements that were beginning to pop up in 30, and many of them in the Galilee, and they gradually spread after Jesus died, and it's nothing to do with Jesus' death. That heats up much more because the insensitivity of governors like Pilate and other officials of the Romans and the Roman army, the insensitivity to the Jewish needs to remain quiet began to diminish, began to exert itself. And they were disrespectful. They would bring things into the city, into Jerusalem, they were not supposed to do. I mean, they would stand on the walls and pick up their skirts, and expose themselves when Jews were doing things in the city. Those are on record. Okay. And so that's one of the reasons why. And this is something Josephus talks about. Josephus is big on trying to explain that the Romans were participants in the radicalization of the zealots who were who really were the driving force for the rebellion. And that the Roman insensitivity, the governor's insensitivity, the soldiers' insensitivity pushed that button. And Josephus on that point is probably correct. All right, Barbara, and then I want to move on. Yes. Go ahead, Barbara.
I know, I had to get it off. What did Jesus do that they was so bad that the priests wanted him out of the way?
Well, we don't know. He was preaching. The problem was, remember, did Jesus say he was the Messiah?
No.
Well, if you read the book of Mark, the answer is yes.
From what I heard, he didn't.
Well, read the Bible, the Christian Bible.
You told me to read the Jewish Bible.
No, first, read that first, then read the Christian Bible. Yes. No, if you read Matthew and Luke, okay, when Caiaphas, the priest, asks him that, he says, "You said it." If you read Mark, Jesus says, "Yes." So the writers of the Gospels weren't clear or did not want to say it explicitly. Now, it's possible that in order to soften this whole discussion and make the point that Jesus was not anti-Roman, that he didn't say that he was. Mark is the earliest version of it, as far as I learned, regarding the synoptic Gospels. Okay, it's Mark, Matthew, and Luke in the order of writing. All of this written down after 70. But of course, the ideas were percolating before that. But you have this statement in the book of Mark where Jesus says, yes, read it. Okay? In Mark. All right?
Jesus says yes, what? To what?
The high priest asks him, are you the Messiah? And he says yes. Okay? So if that's, one second, Margaret, I see your hand. If that is the point, and if that is correct, then that's reason for why the priests would have been very upset. Because it makes now you have a Jew running around saying that Caesar is not the king of the Jews. I am.
Okay.
And you have on his cross, I mean, again, this is in the Gospels. You don't know the exact wording, but the sign on his cross says, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And by coincidence, it happens to be the fact that they would put a sign on top of the cross that explained why the person was being crucified. And if he claimed to be King of the Jews, explains itself right there. That means he's denying Caesar. And that's a capital crime. And that's why he was on the cross. Okay? So, we are dealing with a paucity of information during a period and a series of events that changed the nature of the world. We don't know what we're talking about. All right. Moving on. All right. So again, you did slay Christ. You did lift violent hands against the Master. You did spill his precious blood. You who live in Antioch in 388. Now continue reading someone. This is why. All right. After the bold print, please, someone read. My voice is giving out on me.
You want me to read?
Yes, thank you, Bernie.
Okay, but do not be surprised. I call the Jews pitiable.
No.
Before that,
you see there's a number 10. You see where it's bold. You did.
Yeah, this is where you have no choice, no chance for atonement.
That's it.
Which sounds very unchristian, but that's another story.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm trying to see. Turns himself away from you. You slew Christ. You, is it the page before that or?
No.
Yeah, it's before.
Read that. This is why you have no chance for atonement. Read that and continue.
I'm not seeing the bold. I'm looking at Sermon 1. Is that where we are?
No, Sermon 6.
No.
Okay.
The previous page.
Okay.
Second paragraph.
Okay. Will you let the guilt of blood? Let's see. Did it start with origin? Where before?
No.
That,
second
right?
paragraph. John Chrysostom.
Okay.
Now go down. You see the bold print in the middle?
Yes, you do. Okay. Yes, I do. Okay. That is why you have no chance for atonement?
Yes.
Excuse our defense. In the old days, your reckless deeds were aimed against his servants, against Moses, Isaiah, and Jeremiah. Even if there was ungodliness in your acts, then your boldness had not yet dared the crowning crime.
Okay,
but
stop. Hold on. So he's saying your ancestors, you Jews, your ancestors took on Moses, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, right? And you did ungodly things because Moses, Isaiah, and Jeremiah all got angry at the Jews, right? And they referred to very bad things that they were doing, particularly idolatry. This is all an allusion to the ongoing issue of Jews incorporating paganism, following paganism. All right, that's the main point here. But he says, your boldness have not yet dared the crowning crime. All right, continue. But now, go ahead, Bernie.
Let's see, where did I stop? But now you put all the sins of the fathers into the shade.
Yes.
Your mad rage against Christ, the anointed one, left no way for anyone to surpass your sin. That is why the penalty you now pay is greater than that paid by your fathers. If this is not the reason for your present disgrace, why is it that God put up with you in the old days when you sacrificed your children to idols, but turns himself away from you now when you are not so bold as to commit such a crime? Is it not clear that you dared a deed much worse and much greater than any sacrifice of children or transgression of the law when you slew Christ?
Okay, there you got it. Okay? So you see here, this is, first of all, Bert, hold on. Bert, I see your hand. So he is taking one element of the biblical account, particularly the rule of King Manasseh, who ruled in the first half of the 7th century, and who did indeed apparently sacrifice children outside of the walls of Jerusalem. Okay? It's there. And that is part of the lead up to Josiah, his son's reform, where he closed down anything that smacked of paganism in the country. So we're talking 7th century BCE. All right, so it's there. It's in the Bible. But that's the only instance where you really have a direct reference to child sacrifice. Okay? And there are laws against that in the Bible, clearly. Laws against it. So you can see the notion of reading selectively, which is a known way of making propaganda, right? Selective reading, that's what he's doing. But he's saying that, and what is more horrific than child sacrifice, right? Think about it. It's the most horrible thing you could think of. So the Jews did that, but that was nothing compared to their responsibility for the death of Jesus. And that guilt remains not in, that was the guilt of the ancestors. He says that. Your guilt is that you killed Jesus, you who are alive now. So in very horrific terms, he's taken what Origen said in a matter of the fact way, but nonetheless, yes. But he's now taking this and saying that the bloodthirstiness of the Jew is such that they're having killed their children pales in comparison with their killing of Jesus, and the blood being on their hands. Pretty bad stuff, isn't it? And this is the notion that carried down this concept, and it was brought forth at different times for different reasons. All right, so first Bert and then Barbara.
You answered my question.
Okay.
I was just wondering when the Jews had sacrificed children. I didn't remember that.
Yeah, all right.
Selective memory.
The Jews actually sacrificed children?
It was one guy, wasn't it? I mean, they're blaming all the Jews for one guy.
It was the king.
King Manasseh.
Yeah.
7th century BCE.
Yeah.
First half, the guy ruled for 50 years. He allowed paganism to again run rampant in Eretz Yisrael.
Oh.
In Judah. He was king of Judah. In Jerusalem, even. Okay? He made, the whole point was, he wanted to somehow make peace with the pagan people around. So one of the ways of doing that, of course, is to give them more freedom. If they lived in areas that Judah controlled, it's okay, you can be pagans. And if they bring, and he authorized the sacrifice of children in Jerusalem, not in the main part of the city, down the hill in the valley of Hinnom, in Gay Ben Hinnom. All right? It's part of outside the wall of the city. All right, now what's another term for hell? Gehenna. You've heard that term?
Yeah.
Gehenna. That is Gay Ben Hinnom. It's the place where children were sacrificed. Well, that's hell on earth. Okay? That was King Manasseh.
Now, he didn't sacrifice, the children weren't sacrificed on the altar like the animals were.
No, of course not. No, he didn't do that because he didn't want to get Hashem angry. I mean, he didn't deny Hashem. He just said there are other ways of worshiping other gods.
And
he didn't want to get any gods angry at him.
So he was kind of a pagan. I mean, the thing I don't get is it was a pagan practice. So these were pagan Jews doing it. So I don't see how they could blame Jews when it was a pagan rite, R-I-T-E.
No, these are Jews. No, the point is the Jews were sinful. He's saying that was a horrible sin. Chrysostom is saying the Jews who were doing that were sinners. They were.
Yeah.
But it's a small percent, wasn't it?
We don't know.
Oh, you don't know?
Who knows?
Could have been one.
Yeah, could have been one. No, but Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Isaiah and others, Hosea, talk about Jews incorporating pagan activity into their worship, not necessarily killing children. That was a unique phenomenon at that point, as far as we know for sure. All right, so I can say no more about that. So that could have been a one, but this guy ruled for 50 years. That's a long time. And nobody knows of the 50 years how much time during that time this was being done. And we don't know who was trying to stop it, if any. Okay, all we know is when Josiah comes afterwards, and you have this new law that is either written then, according to the story, it was found, Deuteronomy, effectively the book of Deuteronomy, where it says, no more worshiping of anybody, Hashem, anybody else, anywhere else in the land. The only place you may worship is in Jerusalem. The only God you may worship is Hashem. End of discussion. And he tore down the shrines, right? I think I mentioned, he tore down the Bethel, the temple there. I mean, he really went after all this stuff. And it's because there was this sense that a horrible, horrible sin had happened. And so that pushed this shift radically in the other direction. All right. But again, did it work completely? Jeremiah, who lived after Josiah died, continued prophesying. He died in 609, did Josiah the king. Okay? And the kings who came after him were not that stable, not that strong, not that committed. And so Jeremiah is telling us, and Ezekiel is telling us, that the worshiping of idolatry, the use of idolatry by Jews, had returned. Okay, we don't know if new shrines were built, but they're talking about this, offering sacrifices, illicitly. So, but no mention is made then of child sacrifice. Okay, so I mean it was a tough thing, all that stuff. But now when you hear all of that mentioned, that's what he's alluding to. Chrysostom is alluding to all of that activity, and he's saying basically it took in the end God did. It's interesting. It's interesting. He fails to mention here how this all ended, which of course was the destruction of the temple and the exile of people. He doesn't refer to it here. There was punishment that was given. He leaves us with the assumption that they got away with all of this. Well, in the end, they didn't, but he doesn't mention that. But that allows him then to talk about the fact that now the Jews are no longer the dominant factor in Eretz Yisrael. They're spread around the whole world, and they are under the thumb of the Romans. They have been seriously reduced in number. Their power is gone, and they're now second-class citizens. All right, and that's punishment for killing Jesus, which is a greater sin than what King Manasseh did. But he's, again, not saying King Manasseh, saying you. Okay, your ancestors. That was then. That was in Bible times. Your ancestors killed children, but you killed Christ. That's his point. Tybalt.
I just want to say that I think even with modern sensibilities, it can be misleading to look for either evildoers being rational or logical or assess things, or people with a bias. I'm just saying well, there weren't that many people, so why did they blame all the Jews? Whatever. I think it's human nature that there are times when being rational and logical and reasonable just aren't going to fly.
Well, it's true, and usually things pop up when things are going bad, okay? And, I mean, the truth is, we don't know. I'm not aware, for example, in Antioch at that moment in time, that there were pogroms against Jews because of what Chrysostom was. As far as I know, there's no record of that. And we know of instances in the early 400s elsewhere, and I'm talking North Africa, where Jews attacked and burned churches. Okay? Now, the numbers of the incidents are small, but they did. So you want to talk pushback. Yeah, there were instances when Jewish communities did say they could, or feel they could push back. But again, the thrust of the government support now for Christianity became very overwhelming. And you have instances now where you have bishops influencing governors or Caesars, kings, get back at the Jews for these things. And there were places where they would say, burn the synagogues, and they did. Okay? We don't know the scope of this. Again, there's small documentary evidence that in the writings usually of churchmen. Okay? So, but that's what was going on. So it depends. It depends upon the extent of influence of religious extremism or any extreme ideology, how that affects the people who make the decisions and how it affects the population. Right? And yes, so I'm not saying, I don't know, one could argue Adolf Hitler was psychotic. It probably was crazy. Okay? But at the same time, there's no question that he was smart enough to know how to take his zeal and focus it in certain ways, that he could arouse the German. And no question he succeeded for 12 years or so, for 13 years or whatever. But of course, in the end, that caught up with him. And in certain ways, because his focus on the Jews, it did weaken, as some people say, his army or his military efforts. And in the end, they lost. They probably would have lost anyway. But the point is, it didn't work out for him. But yeah, I don't think he had all his marbles. No. But I'm not sure. But it's not just the individual who is like a Chrysostom here. He was an imbalanced guy. We know that because, again, he was fired from his position here because he wouldn't listen to his superiors. So they moved him to a church, of all places, in Byzantium, in Constantinople, right, which became the center of the Eastern Church. But he's still a Catholic, all right. But he moved there. It's not like he got someplace out in, Podunk, Idaho. Now it's a big situation, big community. All right. So he still had some impulse, influence. Anyhow, so you can say some of these people are imbalanced, but an imbalanced person can still create his own rationale and think logically and pay attention to how people respond to things and continue to move in that direction unless he stopped. Okay, the first homily. Now you're going to see a much more virulent general attack on the Jews. This was his first sermon of this kind. And it lays some things out. And you can see as we think down the road the impact that something like this might make. All right. So somebody please read John Chrysostom, 8 Homilies Against the Jews, Sermon 1. Okay, Bert. Wait, somebody else had a hand.
Somebody else, that's fine.
I was just going to say, this is Judith, I could read. All right.
Do you want to read?
Sure. Sermon 1, but do not be surprised that I called the Jews pitiable. They really are pitiable and miserable. When so many blessings from heaven came into their hands, they thrust them aside and were at great pains to reject them. The morning sun of justice arose for them, but they thrust aside its rays and still sit in darkness.
All right, so what's the morning sun of justice that they thrust aside?
Jesus?
Jesus, yes. All right, you're going to see now darkness and light. That becomes his theme. Okay, Judith, please continue.
We We who were nurtured by darkness drew the light to ourselves and were freed from the gloom of their error. From their childhood they read the prophets, but they crucified him whom the prophets had foretold. We did not hear the divine prophecies, but we did worship him of whom they prophesied.
Hold on, wait 1 second, okay? So you get the point here. We had the opportunity, we had the light, but we ignored it. And we crucified him, or they. All right, this is now talking past, okay? They crucified him whom the prophets had foretold. So the pagans who lived in darkness, they found the light. And the Jews who could have had the light ended up in darkness, as witness the crucifixion. Okay, continue.
Although those Jews had been called to the adoption of sons, they fell to kinship with dogs.
Hold on. They were called to the adoption of sons, referring to them. That they were called upon to become the sons of whom?
Jesus?
God. Deuteronomy. Banim atem ladonai.
Oh, like the children of God, yeah.
You are the children of God.
Oh, yeah.
Right? That statement. That's what he's talking about. They could have achieved that, but instead they fell into kinship with dogs. So we're now seeing a statement of the dehumanizing of the Jew. All right, continue, please.
We who were dogs received the strength through God's grace to put aside the irrational nature which was ours and to rise to the honor of sons.
Okay, so they were dogs. In other words, they were pagans, right? And a pagan acts like a dog because they do bad things. All right, but however, they put aside that irrational nature and they rose to the honor of sons by accepting Jesus. So they left their doghood behind and achieved sonhood, whereas the Jews who were offered sonhood left that behind and ended up with doghood. All right, continue.
How do I prove this? Christ said, "It is no fair to take the children's bread and to cast it to the dogs."
Right. Matthew 15:26, which has nothing to do with his anger about the Jews. Taken out of context. Go ahead.
Christ was speaking to the Canaanite women when he called the Jews children and the Gentiles dogs.
Yes.
But we see how thereafter the order was changed about. They became dogs and we became the children. Paul said of the Jews, "Beware of the dogs, beware of the evil workers, beware of the mutilation, for we are the circumcision."
All right. So what does Paul, that's Philippians 3:2. What does it say? Beware the dogs, the evil workers, beware who are these people? They are the ones who are mutilated. But the Christians are the circumcision. What?
Wait, isn't that
what are they talking about?
Dvarim, circumcision of the heart?
Correct. Mutilation is circumcision of the flesh. Who circumcises the flesh? Jews. The Romans considered that mutilation. That was not simply Chrysostom. That was one of the things that held back for centuries Christians converting to Judaism. The circumcision was. To them, that was like being castrated in that same category. Okay? So they're more, that's more dog-like. Whereas the Christians, the pagans who were dog-like and found the light, right? They are the true people who are circumcised, as Tybalt told us, Deuteronomy, circumcise your heart, meaning remove the stubbornness from it, so you'll fully understand and believe God appropriately. All right? That's a metaphor. Okay? But the Christians were being taught that they are the ones, this is Paul's teaching this. Remember, he was circumcised. Paul was circumcised.
He was Jewish.
He was Jewish. But he picked up and saw the light. So he's now talking to the pagan world and saying, you don't want to mutilate your bodies. You don't need to be circumcised. You're not becoming Jews. Your path to God is through Jesus. You can see the light. Just circumcise your heart.
Oh.
Remove the darkness. See the light. And then you will come to the proper faith. Okay? But as long as the concept of dogs, and again, I'm assuming that when Paul writes this, he's doing that as a metaphor. Right? And here even Chrysostom is, because he's saying we were pagans once. We pagans, right? We were dogs, but we gave up our being dogs when we saw the light. So a change took place in our very nature, and we circumcised our hearts. The Jews circumcised their flesh, and they became more fleshy, less spiritual, in the darkness, dog-like. All right, now he's sort of playing on a metaphor here. But you can understand that he's the one, for example, who will say about the synagogues, he would say, you think that there are pious Jews in here, or in other of his homilies. He's saying, no, there are demons in that synagogue. You can't see them, but they're there, because that's what the synagogue is. It's a haven, it's a synagogue of demons. Because the Jews are in league with the demons. This is a precursor to the concept of the Jews. We saw that in John. You are of your father, the devil, right? So in other words, these are basically places where the spirit of the devil is operating. And the people who are, who partake of that are the Jews. And you shouldn't be there, Mr. and Mrs. Christian, because that is going to corrupt you. Get out of there. So this is all part of this image that he creates as a means of scaring the Christians from going into the synagogues. But he does a great job on really demeaning the Jews. And of course, if you're reading this centuries later, when the whole issue of the status of the Jew comes into play, this is going to play this is going to play itself out in a certain way as how you view the Jews. Okay, and this continues, for a long time. I remind you, the horns on the heads of the Jewish students at the university. Right? We talked about that. 21st century. No, I don't know. It's still a new century. 20th century. Jews in a college walking around. Christians are looking at their heads. Where are your horns? Intellectuals. The concept of something is wrong with the Jew continued in America. All right, Tybal.
And I don't remember because I haven't read the Quran that much, but when the parts of the Quran that accuse Jews of not being human, do you happen to know, is that dogs too, or is that monkeys?
No, I know, yeah. No, it says that the Jews are pigs and monkeys. But you've got to read the whole text there. And again, this is a matter of selective citation, because this is talking about Jews who do not follow the law. Jews who do not follow the law are like pigs and monkeys. That's what it says. All right, read it. I forget the surah. I don't remember right now. It is used, right? And in the same kind of context, the whole thing of the rock saying there's, hey, Muslim, there's a Jew behind the tree here. You can kill him. He's hiding. All right. Again, that is, Muhammad appears to recognize the fact that there were, remember, he's writing about the Jews whom he saw in the Arabian Peninsula, okay, who became his enemies. But he probably saw in these Jews who were not really pious people. They're living far away from the center, right? They work with the pagans in the country in matters of business. And so it's very possible that those Jews struck him as people who were not very pious Jews. And that's the tone you find in the Quran. But again, a preacher like a Chrysostom who pulls something out of context and makes a whole sermon about the Jews as being pigs and monkeys, and it says so right in the Quran. So you can take it out of context, and then you come up with a hateful sermon. So we've done the same thing. I told you, there are rabbis, I don't know if they still use this line, but there were rabbis, extremist Jews in Eretz Yisrael who called the Muslims, come on, it's happening again. Amalekites. Okay, and what does the Torah say to do to the Amalekites?
Cut them off.
Wipe them out. Wipe them off the face of the earth. All right? And that's rabbis preaching about Arabs. So, we're not, we can be held guilty on this whole process as well. That's what happens when you have extremism and you have extreme situations. That's sad, but that's us. That's the human race. Bert.
Okay, you're a rabbi. Maybe you can give me some advice.
He's a rabbi? I didn't know that.
How do we deal with all this? I mean, we're sitting here and it is so disturbing, so incredibly, and some of this stuff, I could imagine turning on the TV on Sunday nowadays and seeing, maybe not exactly that, but it's just so, I don't even know how to deal with it.
Look, we have to solve that problem, first of all, about how we deal with Jews who disagree with us, one way or the other. All right? We have to create a modus vivendi or a means of communicating that we can express our feelings without ending up yelling and screaming.
I was talking about this whole, we've heard nothing but this liturgy of Jews are dogs and Jews are horrible and Jews are terrible.
Right.
I know we can't get rid of anti-Semitism, but as a Jew, it's just so difficult to be called all those things.
Well, look, the point is there are plenty of Christians who can contextualize this, can understand that this is a process of history. It's not necessarily God's truth, or it's a misinterpretation of God's truth. And so the whole point is, this is going on today. You don't hear much about it, all right? But there are forums where Jews and Christians get together regularly and, talk about what binds them together. You'll find that on all across the spectrum, by the way. There are evangelical Christians who sit with very Orthodox Jews and very comfortably talk about things. And they may, I don't know how they deal with biblical interpretations.
Let me put my question a different way. What would you say to children about how to deal with the idea that we are hated and called dogs? Forget about fixing it. I'm talking about as human beings, how we just deal with
First of all, I would not teach this to young children. This is to be taught to children who have more mature minds. And they have to understand that this is part of the process that exists across the human race. That when we find people who are different than we are, whose presence challenges us, and whose presence we assume means that we are under attack in some way, we reach out to people who are dealing with that and great fear of it, we'll go ahead and take certain extreme measures. This guy was afraid, Chrysostom was afraid that these Christians would become tainted by Judaizing. Not that they would walk away from Jesus, but they would taint their faith by incorporating elements of Jewish ideas or practices that he believed would negate their faith in Jesus ultimately. Okay? I mean, again, not much different from Deuteronomy, that process, that fear. All right? And it's when Jews, look, in the Middle Ages, in the 13th century, the church was dealing with rampant heresies all over Europe, all kinds of sectarian groups walking away from Catholicism, maintaining their commitment to Jesus, but reinterpreting it in ways that just negated the church, what the church was standing for. How did they deal with it? They put a crown on the head of various monastic groups, the Dominicans, okay, and others like them, who would go out into they were called the mendicant, not the mendicant, it's the wrong term.
Friars? Do you want friars?
The friars. Yeah, we're talking monks, right? The friars, right? That means the brothers, but they were I can't think of the word right now. They were the begging monks. They didn't live in monasteries. They were out among the people, preaching to the people, trying to confront these heresies. It became a neurosis with the church. Mendicant friars. I think that's right. Thank you, Tybal. Yeah, the mendicant friars. Right. The begging friars. Right. Yeah, mendacious is lying, not mendicant. That's what I got confused. All right. Anyhow, yeah. So they would be supported by people, and the whole point was to undermine the power of these heresies. The church realized, the popes did this. They realized that they are sitting over there in Rome, right? The bishops are sitting in their wherevers, but they're not reaching the people. Get these guys out of the buildings, out into the field. And they were imbued with extreme ideas that the church was willing to tolerate. And in the end, that's what brought down the Jews, because they began to attack Jews because they saw that they were violating the way the Christians understood they're supposed to work, okay, which we're going to learn more about shortly, okay? But they were not living the way they were supposed to live according to church doctrine. In particular, they found out that the Jews did not follow the Bible anymore, or so they thought. They learned about the Talmud. In fact, it was these friars who began to study Hebrew and Aramaic and read the Talmud and read the Midrash in an attempt to try to use them against the Jews to argue in favor of Jesus and Christianity. But along the way, they learned that the Talmud is filled with all kinds of bad things about Jesus, or so they thought. And so that was sort of remedied because they began censoring the books in the 13th century. But you had a burning of the books already in 1242 in France, right in front of the big church. Okay.
Weren't the Jews who burned the Talmud as well?
No, the Jews burned Rambam. By the way, the monks helped them do that. That may have been a precursor for that. In 1232, there were instances where rabbis burnt some of the books of Rambam, particularly the God of the Perplexed, which was philosophy, which cast some shadows about whether God created the world, and they burned them. Yes, but they didn't do it themselves. They brought in the monks to do it. That's a fact of history. But the point is, so these mendicant friars are running around pushing all these things. It was the friars who ran the Inquisitions. Now, generally speaking, Inquisitions up until Spain had nothing to do with Jews. The Inquisitions in the 13th century were dealing with Christian heretics. And you know how those things got out of control. Well, the same thing happened when the Spanish Inquisition evolved in the course of the late 15th century. All right, and you had some churchmen there who were radicals, and they just pushed that whole thing. So my point is, that's all a result of the fact that the church felt threatened by these heresies. And there are instances when popes write, not only were some of these, I forgot, it was one of the friars, one of the popes wrote, it's not just now that we have to deal with the heresies, but we got to deal with the Jews as well, because they're supposed to be the Bible people. We'll read about that in the next packet. They're part of the Bible. They're the people of the Bible. Now suddenly we hear they're the people of the Talmud. Well, us tolerating them is predicated on the fact that we can justify their existence because they bear the Bible. And wherever they are, we know that the Bible's going to be there. And we can use that Bible to help convert people to Christianity. But if they're no longer following the Bible, but the Talmud, then that pulls the rug out of the whole operation. We don't have to tolerate them anymore. So there were times when the mendicants were passing along this message. It didn't work, in terms of getting Jews to stop studying, whatever. So that's when they decided to flip it and use the artillery against them. In other words, use their own midrash against their faith other than Christianity, or to strengthen their faith in Christianity. That failed also, by the way, of course. Okay. All right. So the point is that it's this kind of insecurity in institutions that can push extremism. Okay. Insecurity. In Germany, the people felt that the Reichstag served no purpose, right? So what did they do? Put Hitler in charge. Basically, the parliament there voted themselves out of existence because Hitler said that's the only answer. Because of lack of faith, crisis, get the strong guy, and he will solve the problem. That's what happened. Read the history. So when you're in crisis, you take steps that may not be the best steps. Somebody's going to get hurt.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.